Welcome back, everybody. I'm excited for today's deep dive.
Me too. Always love a good one.
I think today's is going to be particularly fun because we're going into a conversation between Joe Rogan and Bert Kreischer.
Oh, yeah, from Rogan's podcast, right?
Right, from the Joe Rogan Experience, one of the biggest podcasts out there. We're working from the YouTube transcript, so bear with us if it gets a little chaotic at times.
It's Joe Rogan and Bert Kreischer. What do you expect? These guys cover a lot of ground. Comedy, hunting, aliens, you name it. It's all over the place.
Exactly, which is what makes it so interesting, but also a challenge to unpack. So our mission today is to extract those key insights, those moments that really make you think, and offer you a shortcut into the heart of their conversation.
Consider us your filter, your guide through the chaos. We'll hit on all those big topics, the stuff that really matters.
Yeah, and I think what struck me right away was the friendship between these two. You can really tell there's a history there.
Definitely a long-standing friendship, and I'd say a mentorship dynamic, too.
Yeah.
You can see how Joe's been a guiding force in Bert's career.
Totally. And when Joe tells Bert to be undeniable, that really stood out to me.
Right. Because it's not just about being good. It's about being so good, so unique, that people can't ignore you. It's that push for those big stages, the theater shows, the Netflix specials.
And you can really see how that contrasts with Bert's time on the Travel Channel, which he, kind of jokingly called a velvet prison.
Yeah, he was making good money, but it wasn't that fuck you money, as he put it. Not the kind that lets you call the shots.
And then there's that classic story about Joe calling Bert while he's in Vietnam.
Oh, yeah, riding a motorcycle, no helmet, probably a few drinks in him. And Joe's like, dude, you got to step it up. It shows how much he believed in Bert.
It's that belief, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of surrounding yourself with what they call great white sharks, those driven, successful people who push you.
Makes you think about your own circle, right? Who are the people in your life who are pushing you to be better? Who are your great white sharks?
Good question. And speaking of pushing boundaries, they get into the evolution of comedy and podcasting, which is fascinating.
What's interesting is how podcasting was initially mocked. Even guys like Howard Stern, who were huge on radio, they didn't see it coming.
They couldn't wrap their heads around it, right? It's like how sometimes the biggest innovations are the ones that seem the most ridiculous at first.
Absolutely. And then you had guys like Adam Carolla leaving traditional radio and finding massive success in podcasting. That was a turning point.
And let's not forget about Phil Hendry, who was doing these incredible prank calls.
Oh, man, Phil Hendry was a genius. Playing both sides of the conversation, making people genuinely angry. That takes talent. Even Bert's dad was fooled.
That's amazing. And then you have Art Bell on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, talking about aliens and time travelers from his bunker in the desert.
Art Bell was a trip, man. That
Yep.
Coast to Coast AM show was just so bizarre and compelling. And Bert was a guest. He was psyched about it.
It just shows the breadth of what was happening in those early days of broadcasting and podcasting.
And all these figures laid the groundwork for what we're listening to today, in a way. This explosion of voices and ideas.
Absolutely. And speaking of voices and ideas, they get into the whole issue of censorship and free speech, especially with the fines Howard Stern faced back in the day.
Millions of dollars in fines for what was considered indecent on radio. And they make the point that a lot of podcast content today would have been banned back then.
It's crazy, right? Those arbitrary lines. Like you could say dickhead, but not cunt. It makes no sense.
And then the whole debate about suck my dick and the N-word. It's complex, right? What words are off limits and who gets to decide?
I mean, their argument is that if you can't fully express yourself because of certain words, then you're not really free. And Bert's take, grow the fuck up if certain words offend you, it's a pretty blunt approach.
No sugarcoating there. But it brings up this question of personal responsibility. How do we navigate content that might offend us? And how much should be censored?
Good question. And then they switch gears, talking about influencers and physical appearance, especially those attractive women in traditionally male-dominated spaces.
Interesting dynamic, right? They bring up Paige Spiranak, the golfer who's got a massive following. But as Bert points out, maybe not for her golf skills alone.
Right, which begs the question, what does it take to be successful online? Is it talent, looks, a bit of both?
And they're pretty frank about the advantages and disadvantages of being attractive, especially for women. It's like a Willy Wonka golden ticket, Bert says. But it can also come with unwanted attention, even stalking.
Absolutely. And that's where the conversation about better mental health resources comes in, because that kind of pressure, that level of visibility, it takes a toll.
No doubt about it. And then they move on to storytelling, and Bert recounts his dinner with Taylor Sheridan, the filmmaker.
Oh, yeah, he was really impressed with Sheridan, calling him a great American storyteller. Even compared him to Hemingway, which, is a bold statement.
But it speaks to the power of Sheridan's work, those gritty, realistic narratives. And then they get into vampire movies. Nosferatu, 30 Days a Night, all that.
They really go down the rabbit hole there, discussing vampire familiars, which I had to look up, and debating the whole idea of what makes a movie best picture.
Their point being that it used to be about being entertaining, reaching a wide audience, not just tackling specific social issues. They use Pulp Fiction as an example, a film that's wild and violent, but undeniably brilliant.
Pulp Fiction, Shawshank Redemption, those 94 movies were just different, weren't they? And then they talk about the Oscars, how the Will Smith slap kind of changed everything.
Definitely shifted the focus, right? Took away from the actual filmmaking. And then from movies, they jumped to game shows, which is another interesting term.
Yeah, Bert talks about his time on Fear Factor and all the rules they had to make it fair. Blindfolds, keeping the stunts secret, all that.
Which highlights the whole issue of rigging, right? Because then they bring up those quiz show scandals from the past. Turns out those were pretty common.
And then there's the story about Whitey Bulger, the mobster, who allegedly rigged the lottery. Not once, but twice.
Talk about audacity. The guy sets himself up with a 20-year income stream just by figuring out the system. It's wild.
It really is. And then the conversation takes a pretty dark turn, with Bert talking about his encounters with some shady characters.
First, there's the Taekwondo student who turns out to be a mob hitman, just casually learning martial arts. That's chilling.
And then his friend Richie, who goes to jail and comes out way more dangerous, as Bert puts it, involved in some pretty heady stuff.
Including a murder, if I remember correctly. And then that moment when the hitman asks Bert about the best way to kill someone. I mean, come on, that's straight out of a movie.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff. It's like a glimpse into a world that most of us are thankfully oblivious to.
Makes you realize there are some dark corners out there.
Yeah.
But okay, let's shift gears again before we get too creeped out. They talk about how health and fitness next, right?
Right. Bert gets into his whole sleep apnea routine, the mouth tape, the special mouthpiece. He's got it all figured out.
And then there's his uveitis, which he calls his goozle that swells up at night. That's got to be uncomfortable.
And of course, Joe gives him the classic advice, get your deviated septum fixed, dude. Which, probably good advice. And then Bert tells a story about injuring himself during a tough mutter.
Even the fittest guys have their setbacks, right?
Yeah.
It shows that health is a journey, not a destination. You're always working on it.
That's a good point. And then they get into addiction, which is a serious topic, but they handle it with honesty and humor, as they do with most things.
Yeah, Bert talks about his near addiction to oxycodone after a back injury. Pretty scary stuff. And his wife, Leanne, she calls him out on his junkie negotiating.
That's powerful. It shows the importance of having people in your life who can hold you accountable. And then he contrasts that with seeing someone clearly on oxys at a luau, which highlights how addiction distorts your perception.
It's a serious issue, but they don't shy away from it. And then they get back into fitness, talking about their routines. Bert is all about those guys who program their own workouts. The real hardcore guys.
Whereas Joe, he's got a trainer, which is more relatable to me, honestly. And then Bert's analogy for goal-oriented workouts. It's like a wolf showing up at your house.
That's a great visual. Suddenly you're motivated, right? You've got a reason to train. And then they talk about wolves being reintroduced in Colorado, how they decimated the elk population.
Nature is brutal, man.
Yeah.
And speaking of nature, they get into encounters with wildlife, starting with Bert's snake phobia.
The hose bucket thing, that's classic. And then they go through the whole rattlesnake versus coral snake rhyme, which, might actually come in handy someday.
Red touch yellow, kill a fellow. Red touch black, venom lack. I'm going to remember that. And then Bert talks about his pit bull, Frank Sinatra, who would kill anything that came into the yard, including rattlesnakes.
Badass dog. And then they riff about snakes being the reason we wear clothes. Who knows? Maybe they're right. And then there's that crazy story about the fraternity python eating rats.
College kids, man, they do some wild stuff. And then from pythons to possums and coyotes, they cover the whole spectrum of backyard wildlife.
It's a reminder that even in our suburban bubbles, we're not that far removed from nature.
Totally. And speaking of nature, they transition into archery and hunting, which is a whole other world.
Yeah, Joe talks about his tree stand hunting experiences, using all that high-tech gear, the safety harnesses, the amplified hearing devices. It's serious business.
And the whole challenge of aiming from an elevated position, dealing with angles and trajectory. It's a lot more complicated than it seems.
And then there's bow fishing, which brings in the whole issue of refraction. Trying to hit a fish underwater, that's not easy.
Sounds frustrating. And then they talk about draw length, bow poundage, all that technical stuff. Bert has a surprisingly strong draw, apparently.
He had his manly moment at the archery store, which I'm sure was hilarious.
Oh, I bet. And then from archery to UFC and strength training, Bert reveals his bench press record, 325 pounds.
Pretty impressive. They joke about Jack Burt, which I'm picturing now, and then they talk about the early days of UFC, guys like Tank Abbott, those raw, charismatic fighters.
It was a different time, right? And then Bert tells the story about watching UFC live with his wife. She wasn't as into it as he was.
I think a lot of couples can relate to that. Different strokes for different folks, right?
Okay.
And then they get into their celebrity encounters, which is always fun.
Bert met Mel Gibson at a UFC fight, apparently. Said he was a cool dude. And then he talks about sitting behind Ari Gold from Entourage and Peter Berg.
Hollywood mingling. And then they throw out some TV show recommendations, American Primeval, Slow Horses with Gary Oldman. I'm adding those to my list.
Me too. And then they rank Dracula movies, which is classic film nerd talk. And American Werewolf in London gets the top spot for werewolf films.
Practical effects versus CGI, they debate that too. And it's a bummer that the Universal Monster Movies series never panned out.
That would have been cool. But on a positive note, they talk about Brendan Fraser's comeback and Mickey Rourke's resurgence.
It's always nice to see those stories, those guys who never gave up.
Yeah.
They recommend Year of the Dragon with Mickey Rourke, which I've never seen.
Me neither. And then there's this reflection on seeing your hero's age, like Harrison Ford in 1923. It's bittersweet, you know?
Totally. And then they go through all those classic Harrison Ford stories, how he got cast as Han Solo, the sword fighting scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, all the iconic roles.
And Bert admits he didn't know Darth Vader was Luke's father. Come on, Bert, how did you miss that?
Hey, we all have our pop culture blind spots, right? But it just goes to show how much influence these movies and characters have on our lives.
They really do. And then the conversation circles back to storytelling and culture, starting with the appreciation for guys like Taylor Sheridan who can just hold a room with their stories.
Yeah, and then they talk about cattle ownership, which is kind of random but funny. And then Bert's experience jogging in Serbia.
Oh, yeah. He talks about the physicality of the Serbian people, their love for basketball, how intense they are.
And he brings up Hamzat Chimaev, the USC fighter from Chechnya, known for his aggressive grappling style. It's like, how does your culture shape your fighting?
That's a good question. And then they jump back into the comedy world, talking about phones in clubs, the yonder pouches at the comedy store.
It's a sign of the times, right? Having to lock up your phone to enjoy a live show. And they talk about that competitive dynamic between comedians, how it can be toxic but also inspiring.
It's a fine line, but it sounds like their comedy group is pre-supportive, which is awesome. And Bert talks about hanging out with Dave Chappelle, getting advice on his special.
That's like a master class right there. And they talk about the importance of avoiding jealousy, having a healthy mindset. Easier said than done sometimes.
Definitely. And then they talk about the different styles of comedy, from Dave Chappelle to Bill Burr to Ari Shaffir.
And then there's that bit about Ari Shaffir's chickens in Hawaii. Hilarious. And Tommy Buns, the comedian who's known for his aggressive style.
Yeah, he's apparently huge in places like Dublin and Hawaii where they appreciate that kind of humor. And then they talk about Dubai, how Bert was offered a gig there.
But with all the restrictions, he wouldn't even be allowed to take his shirt off on stage.
Which, you know, classic Bert, he refuses. He'd rather perform shirtless at a Buffalo Wild Wings than be censored in Dubai.
I mean, it raises that question. Where's the line between freedom of expression and respecting cultural norms? That's a tricky one.
It really is. And then finally they talk about the Comedy Store, which has a crazy history.
I mean, a murder happened on the front patio. And then there's the mob connection, the whole feeling that anything can happen there.
It's legendary for a reason, right? And they compare mob movies to war movies, how they evoke different kinds of fear. And then there's that poignant moment where Bert talks about his grandfather at Normandy.
It's a reminder that even in a lighthearted conversation, those heavy topics can come up.
And then just to wrap things up, they touch on some broader cultural observations, the intensity of Serbian basketball, the different ways friendship is expressed.
And they contrast people from war-torn countries with those from more peaceful places. It's like, how does your environment shape your worldview?
It's a big question. So, I mean, that was a lot. This deep dive into Joe Rogan and Bert Kreischer was a whirlwind. We went from comedy to hunting to aliens to mob hitmen to Serbian basketball.
It was all over the map, but that's what makes it so fun to analyze. And hopefully we've given you a good overview of the key points, those moments that really matter.
Exactly. So, as always, we want to leave you with something to think about. Consider those balances in your own life. The freedom versus responsibility, security versus passion. Think about those people who have influenced your journey. And maybe even explore why certain parts of this conversation resonated with you.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. See you next time.
Until then, keep diving.